All right, everyone. So let's talk about that shooting that just took place in Atlanta. When I first heard of the story, I automatically read that this was a racially motivated attack, and the reason for that is because the shooter, Robert Aaron Long, targeted mainly Asian women. Most of his victims were Asian women. Long murdered 8 people, most of whom were women and most of whom were Asian. So people automatically assumed that this was a hate crime against Asians. And I don't blame people for assuming this or believing this because hate incidences are at an all-time high against Orientals in the United States. So it's understandable that people would automatically assume this. But there is a political official in Atlanta. Her name is B. Nguyen, and she is an Asian American politician in Georgia. And her take is that this attack was something in between xenophobia and misogyny. And I think that this is closer to the truth. Because Long had a sex addiction. He was addicted to sex. And he would go to these Asian spa centers to gratify his sexual urges. In fact, his sex addiction was so bad that Long actually went to a rehab center. And he was there for months. I believe he was there for about 6 months. And while he was there, he got to know someone who was at the rehab center. And this person, I believe his last name is Reynolds, spoke with the media. And he said that he never heard Long say anything disparaging against non-whites or other races. But he did know for certain that Long desperately struggled with sex addiction. Long was also dangerously religious. And by dangerously religious, I mean that he is a religious person, but in a very destructive manner. If you don't believe that this is possible, just read the story about the Jewish leaders who wanted to stone a woman to death after accusing her of adultery. That way of thinking resonates in the story of Long, because Long would go to these spa centers to gratify himself, and then he would feel enormously guilty. Now, listen, we're men here. I understand there are women who watch my channel, but according to YouTube analytics, the majority of the people who listen to me are men in their 30s and 40s, and some of them are in their 20s. Male sexual urges, this is very normal, very common. I get it. Completely understand. We are human at the end of the day. The problem is that Long, instead of having some sort of introspection and dealing with his problem by understanding and by acknowledging that the problem lies within himself and within his own flesh, Long began to blame the women. He began to blame the prostitutes. He began to blame the women at these spa centers. And so instead of saying, well, I'm at fault at the end of the day for continuing this vicious circle, instead of trying to work to know himself, and I think that one of the most difficult things that someone can do, probably the most difficult thing that someone can do, is to know themselves. I find this extremely difficult, and I'll talk about that in a little bit here. But instead of Long pursuing that path towards self-actualization and introspection, Long began to blame the women. Now, there is a post that you can, the church took it down, but Long did go to a church. I believe it was called the Crab Apple Baptist Church. And I'm not blaming the church for this, just to get that clear. I'm not blaming the church, but the fact is that he did go to this church, he was baptized there, and he did a video for the church saying that he was That he, for years thought himself to be a Christian, but he realized that he had no fruit to show for it, and so he got baptized, and I guess he had some sort of a born-again experience. But his fruits really didn't show for that, and Long, again, instead of struggling with his sinly nature, decided to blame other people, which is really a sign of weakness. When you start blaming people for your own sinful ways, that's when you're really in a state of weakness. Because I think it takes a lot of strength to recognize that you are the problem, and that you are someone who has the agency to stop what you're doing. Long went to 3 different spa centers that he reportedly attended, or he reportedly frequented to satisfy himself. And he murdered people. He murdered 8 people, most of whom were women and most of whom were Asian. Now, there is a report saying that a witness heard him say, death to all Asians, or I want to kill all Asians, or something like that. And this may be true. This is why I don't want to automatically cancel out the opinion that this was racially motivated. It's possible that it was racially motivated, but I will say that if it was racially motivated, it was partially racially motivated. And I think the biggest factor in this story, or the biggest factor in Long's motive, was his sex addiction, and on top of that, his inability to have introspection and to recognize that he was the sole problem behind his addiction. He was the cause of his addiction. And that inability to see that gave him the conviction that he was right to murder these people. This is like when Jesus says, the one who has no sin cast the first stone. This is what Jesus was talking about, this mentality. Well, yes, I'm a sinner, but I'm going to put the blame on someone else. I'm going to put the blame on the prostitute, and I'm going to murder the prostitute. It's a Pharisaical mentality. And I know I sound like some evangelical right now, but that's really the reality of it. There is a very strange phenomena in the United States, and this is probably in other parts of the world as well, Western Europe, anywhere where technology is supreme. Technology is great, but at the same time, you know what? I'm not going to blame technology on this. That's bogus. We do have a problem in the West with social isolation. People isolate themselves way too much. You see this also in Japan, in other parts of the world. It is a worldwide phenomena, but America has I think, a bad problem with this: loneliness, isolation, and misogyny. There is a problem with hating women in the United States. There is. I've noticed it for years. I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of misogyny because at times dating can be difficult. It can be. At times finding a woman can be difficult. It can be challenging, all of these things. And so it's easy to, in a state of desperation, to fall into misogyny and say, I hate women and women are all whores and all this stuff. I know because, and this is kind of difficult for me to say, but I think I would be somewhat of a hypocrite if I don't at least admit this. But I've kind of been there, like struggled with dating, trying to find a date, and it doesn't work out, and you get mad and you react. And there's a saying, it's a very common saying, it takes one to know one, and that's 100% true. It takes one to know one, and I know that mentality because there have been some toxic and dark moments in my mind where I've fallen into that trap, and that trap is very easy to fall into. It's very easy to just fall into that and say, well, women are this and that, instead of just realizing, well, not everyone is for everyone, and just being comfortable with yourself and being comfortable with being alone. Like I have become, And I think quarantine has really helped me with this. I have become quite comfortable being by myself. I have become very comfortable with the idea of staying single. You know, I would like to get married one day and all that stuff, but I have become quite comfortable with, maybe it won't happen. I don't know. I hope it does, but maybe it won't. I'm not entirely sure. And yeah, I think I've really come a long ways with that. And I think a lot of that, one thing that really helps is having introspection, reflecting on yourself, reflecting on what makes you tick, why you feel the way you do. And I came to the realization that, well, all that anger is just weakness. That's what it is. It's weakness. It's the fact that you're too weak, you're too scared to look at yourself. You're too scared to know yourself. I think one of the scariest things is to know yourself, because then you have to acknowledge your weaknesses. You have to acknowledge your lack of skills in certain areas. You have to acknowledge who you are. And you also have to acknowledge who you're not, because we all have this idea in our heads of who we are, but many times that idea is wrong. So you have to acknowledge who you are not. And you also, in that, you have to acknowledge who you actually are. And I think once you realize and once you acknowledge your failing, your weaknesses, your strengths, and your lacking, once you realize the areas that you're lacking in, and you acknowledge it, and you say, okay, I acknowledge that this is who I am, then things like rejection, even being rejected by women, it's not that much of a sting anymore, if that makes any sense. So it's like you become more relaxed, And I have become way more relaxed, especially near the end of 2020 and going into this year. I've noticed a huge change in me. Maybe it's because I'm 30, but I've noticed a huge change in my mind and a huge change in my way of thinking. I still have struggles like anyone else, but I've come a long way, I would say. But I think that the best thing that you can do as a human being is to acknowledge your weaknesses. Don't blame other people for them, but to acknowledge your weaknesses. Because once you start blaming people, that's weakness. You fall into weakness. And when you fall into weakness, you don't want to acknowledge your weakness. So what you end up doing is covering that weakness with hatred. And there's a big movement on the internet, especially on YouTube and on forums, all dedicated to hating women. We talk about third wave feminism and we say, oh, the SJWs, they hate men. And yes, there's definitely truth in all that. But there's also a problem with misogyny. There's a big problem with misogyny. And I get it. A lot of that hatred comes from men's bad experiences with divorce and with all these things. But the worst thing that you can do is to fall into weakness. Because when you fall into weakness, you don't want to acknowledge your weakness because you have too much of an ego and you're too pride-filled. And then you want to cover that weakness with hatred because that hatred makes you appear strong. It gives you this self-perception of strength. And then you start going into the forums and into the videos, and you start watching these videos where, a guy's going to say something like, yo, man, these hoes, man, stay away from these hoes, man. Just stay away from them, man. They're bad, man. Hoes are bad. Women are bad, man. Women, they just want to use up your resources and blah, blah. And you start watching these videos, and they start what? They start reassuring your hatred. They start reinforcing it. So now you have a justification for your hatred. And when you have a justification for your hatred, you have a justification for your weakness, and you stay in that vicious circle, that vicious cycle, and it's very difficult to get out of it because you don't want to acknowledge your weakness because you're so filled with pride. Again, it takes one to know one. But once you acknowledge your pride, once you acknowledge your weaknesses, and you understand, yes, I'm weak in this area, and I'm going to fall, and I'm going to have issues, but it's a very dirty road ahead to getting out of this. Once you take that step, then you can free yourself from that hatred. That's really what it is. It's weakness. It really is weakness. But this long guy, you know, he was in a state of mind almost like Judas Iscariot. You know, Judas was so ashamed of what he did when he betrayed Christ that he killed himself. And guess what? You know, Peter backstabbed Jesus. Peter denied Christ 3 times. And Peter could have gone that same route. He could have gone down that same road of weakness, of despair, and all those things. But he didn't. He didn't. He acknowledged his sins. He wept because of his sins. But he embraced Christ's forgiveness. And he ended up becoming a martyr. Whereas Judas, he fell into weakness. Judas was a weak person. He was weak for his greed, and he was weak in his self-hatred. He ended up hating himself, and he hated, and let's get a little bit more spiritual here, Christ is an incarnation of humanity itself. He is the hypostatic union between the divine and humanity. And so Judas, when he betrayed Christ and essentially took part in the murder of Christ, he took part in the murder of humanity. And in his hatred for humanity, he ended up hating himself to the point that he acquiesced to his weaknesses. And instead of acknowledging his weaknesses and embracing forgiveness, he ended up destroying himself. Whereas St. Peter took the correct route. He acknowledges his weaknesses. He understood his weaknesses. And he embraced forgiveness. And he found freedom. It's a very difficult road. Extremely difficult. Isn't it fascinating that as humans, the most difficult route we can take is the one that appears to be the softest and the weakest and the wimpiest? In society's eyes, the most difficult route is the one that in society's eyes, in society's perception, appears to be the wimpiest. Because in society's eyes, in the eyes of the ego, in the eyes of pride, forgiveness, acknowledging your wrongdoing, all of these things appear wimpy because they appear wimpy to our pride. When the reality is that those are actually the routes of the strong. I think this is one thing that Jesus was teaching was, loving your enemies and forgiving people. This actually takes inner strength. It takes a strength that is more difficult than anything that one can do in a gym. It takes an immense amount of physical strength. Not physical. It takes an immense amount of mental strength and spiritual strength and spiritual fortitude to acknowledge when you're wrong. It's very difficult. So truly, the most difficult route is to know yourself. Because to know yourself is to know your weaknesses. And to acknowledge your weaknesses is to come closer to God. Because by acknowledging your weaknesses, you embrace forgiveness. And what does St. Paul say? In my weaknesses, I am strong. And in the acknowledging of your weaknesses, you embrace salvation. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.